Hello and welcome to the Power of Play. My name is Stacy Johnson and I'm the marketing coordinator here at Johns Hopkins Center for Talented Youth. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Amy Shelton, Executive Director at CTY. Dr. Shelton holds a faculty appointment in the School of Education and has held joint appointments at the School of Medicine and the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences, and has served on the University Steering Committee for the School Science of Learning Institute. She is an advocate for bright students in every community and has dedicated her research to the design and delivery of innovative educational models and approaches that support the diverse community of leaders. Amy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stacy, and welcome everybody. This is a topic very near and dear to my heart, as many of our webinars are. But I'm glad to talk to you about this today because this is something we've been talking about for many years, and it continues to evolve. So as I was approaching this, I was sort of looking back at ways we've talked about play in the past, and it's kind of fun to see new things coming on the horizon. And I'm going to start, as Stacy said earlier, I'm going to start with a question. And that is, if you could put in the Q&A just your answer to this. What is the opposite of play? I'm going to have Stacy help me out.
Yes. Let's see. Here we go. The first one that comes through is depression. I know. We have work, grind. Work would have been, I think, my first response for sure. Taking orders, work, chores. Oh, we've got some emotions. Sadness, suffering, any activity that doesn't bring joy.
Okay. So you can keep them
Boredom, boredom.
coming.
Yep, boredom,
Yeah.
bored. Okay.
Okay, so I really like the tone that's being set by that. So when we ask this question, we do get a lot of different things. We get things like work as the opposite of play. We get school frequently when you ask kids. School is sometimes listed the opposite of play. We get words like seriousness, labor, drudgery, and then we heard some more in our own chat here. The one word you don't see here is learning, right? And that's kind of at the heart of what we're going to talk about today is that play itself is something we think of as sort of an activity for, for lacking purpose, like that it's really just for enjoyment. But I'm going to hopefully lay the case out for you about why it's actually an important part of what we do, and an important part of education. And in some ways, I hope that you're sort of already sold on that. And what I'm giving you is kind of some of the backdrop to that. But I also expect that maybe some of the things I'll share with you today might be new for you, or at least maybe were impressions you had. And I'm going to try to put some guts behind that and some of the research. And I always like to start with, I think consistent with a lot of the reactions we get is it's actually pretty hard to clearly define play because even in dictionaries, the definitions really rest heavily on the idea that you enjoy it. And this is sort of the most common definition. And what's interesting about this particular definition, and I've seen this in several places, is that it actually contrasts it with things that are serious or for practical purpose. And I think what you're going to see me argue today is that I would lop off that practical purpose part because I don't think it's in contradiction. And if I hope you take home nothing else, I hope that you take home the fact that enjoying an activity does not mean that you cannot learn from it. And in fact, enjoying an activity probably facilitates learning. We've done previous webinars on things like engagement and such, and this is one of those pieces that enjoying something is actually really good for you as a learner. And I'm going to start with, we know this because play and learning start out as one and the same. If you think about how babies learn, babies explore their world. Babies and toddlers manipulate objects, they point and name, they reach around. Many of the toys that we give them are manipulative things that they can handle. And that's learning. That's how they're actually sort of learning about their world. They also live in a world where it's all about trial and error, but we call it trial and error with joy. That is, we give them toys where they have to make things fit and things don't always fit and they have to keep trying. Kids are notorious for building block towers and watching them fall and building them again and watching them fall. And in each of those things, they're learning something. But even something as simple as watching a child learn to sing their ABCs. I always laugh because I have videos of my son over time, and what I realized that was that in the early videos, he wasn't actually singing the letters. He was, it's A, B, C, D, F, G, and L, P. It was sounds, and that those sounds then eventually become letters, and those letters provide a foundation. So we see a lot of this sort of trial and error, but it's a really happy trial and error. So we know right off the bat that early on there is no tangible distinction between playing and learning, and in fact, we invoke that distinction later. And so the next thing I want to do is share a little bit about just some things, so very straightforward observations we've made about why play matters. So I'm going to show you two kids building with blocks. So if you watch this first one, they're actually building the same little tower. And here's the first child doing it. And what you'll see is this child is essentially playing around with the blocks, kind of picking them up, not sure what to do, picks them up, puts them down, kind of doing a little rearranging. There's a lot of thinking going on here, trying to sort of figure this out, and then starts to do some builds. And that's actually a correct part of the structure. So that's actually a correct build. But then the child sort of gets distracted about the fact that it won't stand up and starts playing around some more. And you can see there's sort of a lot of trepidation in this child, not a very fluid build. I wanted to contrast that then with our second child over here on the right. Takes a look at the structure. He's given the bag of blocks. Very deliberately pulls out the first few blocks. You can see this child is building the base. And I hope what you're seeing in these two cases is two very different ways of solving this problem. In one case, kind of struggling. You'll see that the one on the left is actually taking it apart and putting it back together, making some errors in it, kind of struggling with the pieces. Whereas the one on the right is pretty much nailed this thing, start to finish. And so you might ask, what is the difference between these two children? What might be affecting these performance differences? And we ask this, we get a lot of things. We get, well, maybe it's gender, maybe it's from their, socioeconomics. I chose these two children because these two children, at the time they were doing this task, they are the same age, almost to the day. They come from very similar backgrounds in terms of the economic status of their families. They are both children of professors in STEM-oriented fields. So lots of similarities between these two kids. One of the key differences between them is that the child on the right, who's doing the fluid build, has far more block building experience than the one on the left. The parents report that this child, who I happen to know, had blocks available very, very early on, was encouraged to do those types of activities. Whereas the other child, the child on the left there, the parents reported that they actually did not provide those kinds of toys. Those were not the kinds of toys, and that the child's preschool did not have the same kind of playstations that we were talking about for the child on the right. So these two kids had very different experience with block building, and on both the block building and other metrics, they showed extreme differences in their spatial reasoning ability. So this sort of speaks to the fact that in one case, the child had exposure to play that was related to this task, and the other did not. And you might say, well, okay, but what's the relevance of that to learning? Well, this is a particularly interesting skill. And the reason I use it as an illustration is that we know a lot about it. And in fact, spatial skills and block building in particular have been associated with many things in a child's later performance, including their math achievement as they move on into their K-12 education. It's been related to performance in STEM-oriented fields in college. It's been related, there's a relationship between spatial skills and multiple career achievements. And these are things that are independent of other factors. So it's on top of other things that might lead to success. And all of these skills are actually ones that are trainable within reason, but the biggest impact of that training and that exposure comes in early childhood. So this is just an example of how early spatial play, exposing a child to these toys and activities early, seems to give them some edge on skills for the future, for future success. And this work continues in great detail, and they're finding more and more of these kinds of relationships beyond just sort of typical science and math, but into many other areas of reasoning. So that's just to say we already know play is important in this example, but is play really the critical element? And so what I want to share next is some research. And one thing we know about play is that play seems to have some sort of adaptive advantage, or at the very least, it is a trait that survives. And the reason we know that is numerous species show play behaviors, many, many different species. Some just cute examples of what we know, squirrel monkeys and play. There seems to be sort of a relationship between squirrel monkeys who are more playful and those who are less playful. And there's a biological basis for it, where those who are more playful also show lower overall cortisol levels. Now, that could be because the play is bringing their cortisol levels down. It could be that they're more motivated to play because of low cortisol levels, but there is a relationship, and the play itself, the observed amount of play, is related to the cortisol in the system, and cortisol is associated with stress, which also then weakens health. And so those lower cortisol levels are a distinct advantage in a species, and play seems to be the related element here. Another just simple example is a fun one for me, survival in bear cubs. So there's been work showing that if you observe bear cubs during their first year of life, the amount of play they do in the summertime predicts their likelihood of survival through their first winter. So again, there's something about this activity that is good for the species. Okay. Let's move a little bit to a little more in the brain. There's been more work on play in rats. There's been sort of extensive work on watching rats. Rats are a very, very playful species. And we say it's play because we can't figure, in many of the activities they're doing, it's not obvious that it's anything other than kind of what we consider, kind of an activity that's not doing something. It's not getting them food, but it's building something, and we think it's building brains. And in rats, this kind of observation of these play behaviors have been associated with clear changes in brain activation in the learning networks in a rat, more adaptive adult behaviors. So rats that play more as children are more adaptive to their environment as they get older. And they are better social citizens in the rat world. So their behaviors in social situations are also more adaptive and more functional. So, and again, this is a case where the behavior we believe we're observing appears to be like play. And it shows all of the associated brain activations that would suggest that's for enjoyment. In children, play has also been shown to enhance several important factors, including things like executive function, critical to learning and to daily functions. It's been associated with language development. It's been associated with advancing in math and geometry, similar to the spatial play that we mentioned before. It's been shown to enhance scientific thinking, or at least provide a good foundation for building scientific thinking. And it's been shown to be good for social and emotional development as well. So there's a lot to suggest that the behaviors we observe as play really are serving a purpose of building better brains. And there's an understanding of it in neuroscience that actually makes this all make sense. And this is a simplified version of the neuroscience of play for the sake of our time, but it captures the essence of it. And that is that play, when we are enjoying something, and play is one of those really strong examples, active play activates at least two really critical systems. One is the dopaminergic system. This is our pleasure center. This is when you do something fun or you get rewarded, that feeling of reward, that excitement, that pleasure, that's the dopaminergic system. And that system heightens attention, it enhances motivation, and it is what gives us the feeling of pleasure. The other system that sort of gets activated when we play is the norepinephrine system. This is one that is associated with, we think of this as the fight or flight mechanism, but in this case, that's about attention and awareness. And so this is sort of alertness and energy. And both of those things are what drive neuroplasticity, the ability for the brain to change. And learning, if it's nothing else, learning is changes in the brain. So that sort of setting the stage for good neuroplasticity is something that's natural in this play space. Expanding that a little bit, we can talk about the features of play. Play is active. It's doing something rather than passively receiving information. So if you think about the way we learn, doing something to learn is active. Listening to someone like you're doing right now is passive, and play is active. It's engaging because by definition, if we're calling it play, it means we think someone's enjoying it, and we know that maintains interest. It's often a social activity. It can be co-play, kids playing next to each other. We know that's actually, there's a benefit to that in younger ages. It can be actually interacting, but it is often a social activity. Does not have to be, but in many, many cases, particularly educational ones, it is. And it's relevant. Even if we think of play as something we do for entertainment, it is a part of our natural like day. It's connected to your world, meaning that we don't suddenly say we're shutting off everything else and now I'm over here in play mode. Play is something we just kind of do. And there are settings for it, but they are sort of natural, organic settings for us for the most part. And then finally, play is often viewed as a safe space to fail. We've done previous webinars on just the critical importance of opportunities to fail. And play is often one that is safe for failure, not just because it's low stakes typically, but because you're in an environment where the expectation is not some sort of immediate success. The kid knocking over the block tower, yes, there are children that sometimes cry when their blocks fall over, usually because another kid has knocked them down. But typically, kids who are playing with things and things fall apart or don't go well, there's kind of a resilience that comes right along with that because play is just play. And what's interesting is these elements, and we could define them lots of different ways, but this set of elements are all things that have been identified as features of a good learning environment. So again, play really is sort of the space where we should learn. Now, I want to talk a little bit about types of play because this diagram I'm showing you comes from actual work on play-based learning. So this was really defined in classrooms, and it was some observations, in this case by Pyle and Daniels, where they looked at the kind of play that happens across educational systems and kind of tried to classify it. I bring it here because I think when we think about whether it's educators or caregivers supporting children to learn from play, I think these can be useful tools. And I want to share with you what they are. They range from being sort of child-directed, meaning we kind of just let the kids do their thing, kids are making all the decisions, all the way up to sort of adult-directed, where the adult is kind of not necessarily choosing what a child likes to do, but making the offer in a way that is very specific. And I'll start with free play, because this is kind of the most fun one. So free or unstructured play is really, that sort of just being out there and doing things. It doesn't mean you're not doing an activity, but it's very much that the child is free to choose what that is. So this is the most child-driven type of play where a child chooses the sort of the context, the conditions, what resources they're going to grab. So, when you put a child in a preschool classroom for the first time, maybe, they're getting introduced to it and you see them roam about and gravitate to different things. That is a version of free play. They're going and just seeing what's there and using what they want to use. Some of the key features of free or unstructured play are that this is an awesome way to let kids explore options. They have to make decisions. If there's a group, they have to work together to make some of those decisions and to make things work. And they're actively figuring out how to get engaged. They're choosing to be engaged. This is not the type of play that is associated with necessarily specific learning in an area. That is, we can't say, oh, we're going to let our kids free play so they will learn something about X. What we say is they're going to learn something about the world. They're going to go out. We assume learning is happening. We can see learning happening. This is a lot of what we see in babies, but it's not necessarily driven towards a particular area. The next one actually takes it a little step further, and that's inquiry play. And inquiry play is, again, child-driven, but now it's enhanced by the educator or the caregiver. So the best way to illustrate this is with an example. So imagine that children are gravitating towards playing with these toy cars. Like the unstructured, the child is simply playing, but then if you want to make it more inquiry play, and again, there's lots of ways to define this, the caregiver might do certain things like provide age-appropriate books on cars. The child's interested in cars. Let's find some age-appropriate books that teach us about cars. It might be to ask age-appropriate questions either about the cars or about other related concepts. So like looking at this picture, one could imagine for a small child talking about the different sizes of the cars. If you want to put it more about the cars themselves, which one do you think is going to be faster and why? Those kinds of like really taking the play and layering into it opportunities to learn. The next type is collaboratively designed play. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one because this one has much more of an educational settings, but it's really where the experience is kind of designed together, where the child and the educator kind of choose a context and choose the resources, and the play is now directed towards, say, a specific area of learning. So just as an example, we might desire to design an experience for spatial skill learning. I choose that a lot if people notice that because that's actually one of my areas of expertise. I know a lot about the kinds of toys and games that fit there. So you may choose a really targeted activity like a marble run, and maybe set up some particular scenarios within that. And then play within that context is still open-ended, but it's got some bounds around it that kind of encourage the collaborative play, that collaboratively designed play. So it's directed at information, but not necessarily a sort of lesson plan around it. The next one's a little more like a lesson plan. And I do think this is one that works really well for educational settings, but also really any setting. And that's where educators or caregivers offer up sort of targeted experiences. Now, in an educational setting, this might be like almost like a required situation. So this is a little bit getting into what we call like the forced fun part of play. But at home, it can be, really just providing kind of a set of opportunities. It can play off existing interests. But that's where sort of you choose a context and choose the resources. And within that, kind of establish some things you might be able to encourage within learning. And the example I give that, again, there are many, would be something like playing restaurant to learn math. And there are many other things that you can learn in that space. So imagine you have a child who has a play kitchen, or the preschool has a play kitchen, or you're in a setting where that's available. You can sort of structure the play a little bit, by doing things like having the children involved build the menu and the pricing. You start to assign roles. So during the play, children have roles where they actually have to think about certain problems. Like you might have a restaurateur who takes the orders and serves the food and has to tally up the bill and provide people with their bills. You could imagine having customers who are told that they have to keep their orders within certain limits. And again, there's a lot of flexibility because again, this is play, but it's ways to kind of, poke into the play these opportunities to do some learning. And then the last area is probably the most directed, and that is learning through games. And this is another one that, again, very easy to imagine in an educational setting. This is also one that I think is a handy tool for caregivers as well, where you really can look at physical or digital games. Many of them are designed specifically for learning. Lots of games, and most games will have some elements of learning, but some are literally designed around teaching a particular concept. And that can be spelling. There are whole games for spelling, hands-on games for spelling. There are online games for spelling. It can be physics. It can be math. It can be reading. It can be any number of things. The games are out there. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about sort of helping think about how you choose them, but they're specifically designed. And I'll show just one example. And this is from the Kahoot suite of games. And I'm going to show you Dragon Box. And this is a game that can be used at a lot of different ages. They actually have different games for different things. This is the one of the early stages of their algebra game. And so this may not look like it, but this is an algebra problem. This box you see here with the little note on it, there's a dragon in that box, and that dragon needs to be isolated. So that's your finding your unknown. And the way you do that is you have to subtract out, or in this case, I think it's all adding and subtracting, by finding the right element. So I'm just going to play it a little bit so you can kind of see what that looks like. So here I've got to get rid of those two fish that are there with the box, and I've got to do it in the most efficient way possible. And so here is Dragon Box in action. So first thing to do is get rid of these different POs. So the three that are there. And those, so you have to combine them. You have to first flip them and find the opposite, because that's subtracting out, and you've got to do it to both sides. Okay, the dragon's like, you're still not there, it's peeking out. And so now what you have is you have an equation where you've isolated the box, and the dragon eats it. And then they do things throughout this game, like start to substitute in letters and numbers. So you do the same thing, but now you've got letters and numbers, and eventually it converts to being fully, oh, let me stop that. It converts to being fully math problems at some point in the game. And it keeps bouncing back and forth, but it's a very engaging way to teach about isolating for knowns. It adds in division eventually, and so you start to know that you have to actually divide both sides by some number. It gets into sort of more complex pieces as you get farther along, and they have a series of these. So this is a direct way to try to teach algebra, and there are many, many other games like this. So that's just to say there are very specific ways that we can think of, and kids who use this app will report this as, their playtime. I joke that's a little insidious, like, here, we're going to get you to learn algebra, but not really insidious. That's exactly what learning is. This is just a very directed version. So when you're playing, this is one that has specific goals. Get out of here. It's not moving forward. Hold on. Ah, my slides don't want to move forward. Let me see if I can get out of here. Okay. So now what I want to move to is some tips on how to foster play. And some of these, again, are kind of common sense, but hopefully they give you some grounding for how to think about it. And the first is thinking about those targets of learning. So think about the toys and activities in terms of what they might entail. And it's okay. You're not expected to be an expert on all these things, but your instinct's going to tell you a lot. As an adult who has some of these skills, or maybe could be lacking in some of these skills, you'll see these and have a sense of it. So for example, there are little toy robots that can teach you programming. There are many games and toys that foster problem solving or planning. You can think about content knowledge within these spaces. So really thinking, giving some thought to what the toys are doing. And this is true not just for like going out and getting them, but just thinking about the toys that are already in a child's world. What are they actually doing? And everything I'm talking about, I tend to I often tend to focus on some of the things that are for young, but as you saw, there's also things like the algebra and other things that age up with the kids as well. A second one is really quite an important one, which is don't forget that this is really about a child's interest and engagement. And so you do need to match activities to interests. So paying attention to things that engage, consider what's age appropriate. So I joke because there are a lot of people who think Monopoly is a really strong game for teaching some elements of finance, as well as if you're in my house growing up, it teaches you that your older brother cheats. But Monopoly may not appeal to kids. However, there are many versions of Monopoly. And so even something as simple as putting it in a context that a child likes could be a way of engaging. And again, some of it's trial and error, figuring out what they actually like. And my big message here is let your child's curiosity guide the ideas and don't force it. I joke that, in my own house, I'm a scientist and a statistician by training, love chemistry. I raised an engineer. For all my love of chemistry, that was his least favorite class in high school. Couldn't force it, right? Didn't really try to. It's really letting their interests guide, making the opportunities available, but making sure that you're not forcing things that they will disengage on as well. Because again, this is play. A third tip is to really think about the challenge. You need to pay attention to whether or not this is actually challenging their skills, because learning really happens when you are sufficiently challenged. And there's a couple things here. So this is my favorite picture of the zone of proximal development, where you can imagine finding the right path that will teach you something. And it's very easy to gravitate to what's comfortable. And that's good sometimes. Sometimes we just do need a little comfort. There's a reason I do French on Duolingo, because my many years of French means that when I go in to do French on Duolingo, I get a little reward for it being kind of easy. But I also need to do some harder things on there so that I'm more challenged. You can also overdo it by making things too hard. You put it out of reach. And when something is truly impossible, it hampers the learning a bit. So it's really finding that zone of proximal development. What's just right? What's the right amount of challenge so they have to do some work to get there, but they're still having fun and learning something from it. And I, again, do not want to dismiss the idea that sometimes we really do just do the things that are comfortable, because that can be more of a health and wellness kind of break. Whereas the challenging, getting into a space where you're having fun and being challenged, that's where learning and brain breaks really come in. That's kind of giving your brain kind of a fun thing to do. And then finally, I want to talk in those tips. I do want to sort of make it clear that there are a lot of different activities. I think as anyone who's a parent knows, there's a lot out there. And every area of toys has something in the learning space. We tend to think about games and puzzles a lot. And again, these can be language-based, they can be geography, they can be memory games, they can be spatial. There's a whole range. There's a lot of strategy games as kids get older. Well, and more now for younger kids too. We're learning that younger kids can actually build pretty good strategic skills. So wide range of content and skills. So when you pair it with those other things, it's really kind of trying some things that you think are closest to your child's interest, and quite frankly, letting them help pick what they want to do. There are also a lot of ways to do building and manipulating of objects. As we noted in the very beginning, we know that sort of spatial skills start pretty early. Babies are exploring their world. These continue throughout, and they can increase in difficulty dramatically. These are anything that requires you to build and manipulate does not just build spatial skills, it also builds planning and some of the regulatory things in executive function. These foster things like more creative thinking and flexibility, and these can be either directed or free play. And in fact, you don't even have to go out and buy things. You can give kids a stack of cups and off they go. So many things in this space. And then, of course, I've already mentioned that we live in a world now where there has been a lot of attention to the value of apps and video games. And many of them are extremely valuable for teaching skills. So, we always talk about this is a way to put devices to use by being somewhat deliberate. And again, balancing what a kid wants to do and is interested in with things that maybe can bring you closer into that education world. And the big warning with this one is always to keep in mind that this needs to be in moderation. We always say that if you're thinking about games, there's still some value to always having some way to play games in a hands-on way. But the convenience and ease of taking a device with you means that you can have these things with you in many, many different settings. And then the final tip on fostering play is be a role model. And that means a lot of things. Adults benefit from play too. Our brains need that fun and flexibility too. And one way to get into that is to model that behavior for your children. That includes joining your child if and when they allow it, depending on the age and attitude of the child. Sometimes that's welcome, sometimes it's not. But also making time for your own interests and development, and really, embracing the idea that you too can do things that in an adult world, we often say are not of great purpose or are not good use of our time. Yes, they are, because they are helping continue to build and keep your brain active. And then in that space, share what you're learning. Share how you're seeing these things unfold. And the key there is make sure it is authentic, meaning if you're going to model this, it can't be, look, I'm going to try and show you this is fun. If you aren't actually having fun, they're going to see it. And it's not play if you're not enjoying it by definition, right? It's something you enjoy. So make sure it's authentic. All right, so I've given you a lot of different things. I'm hoping that it spurred some questions, but here are some of the basics just to recap. One is that play is a fundamental activity. It just is. We see it everywhere. And so, it's hard to argue that something that you see so ubiquitously is not important. Play builds brains and promotes engagement, which we know is a critical feature. We've done whole webinars on engagement. There are lots of ways educators and caregivers can actually foster play. So you can foster that learning through play. And we've given you some of those tips along the way here. And then what I want to leave you with is that a reminder that what we said in the beginning, authentic play actually creates all the right conditions for learning. And with that, I will say thank you for listening and learning with us.
Thank you so much, Amy. Let me go ahead and stop the recording.